May be seated. All right, this is working. All right, welcome to Jules Dent's senior thesis. Jules was my senior assistant in American history this year, and joining me on the panel today is Mrs. Keenest and Mrs. Gladstone, and I'll pray for us and then let Jules take it away. Heavenly Father God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your goodness in all things. Lord, we thank you for Jules, the way that you have just given her a sharp mind and a passionate spirit. God, we pray that we can learn some things from what it is that she has to say to us today to be better citizens of your kingdom. And it's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.
The American criminal justice system. Does it need to be restarted, or is it working perfectly as it is right now? The American criminal justice system is inherently broken, flawed, and needs a complete rebuilding. Law enforcement is built upon extremist ideologies and full of bad people who use this power only to help themselves. Gerhard Falk is an author of 19 books and over 40 journal articles. He is a professor of sociology at Buffalo State College, where he also teaches criminology and the treatment of offenders. In his book, The American Criminal Justice System, How It Works, How It Doesn't, and How We Can Fix It, he writes, "The police will protect even the most outrageous of conduct by fellow police officers, maintaining a wall of silence that holds that the interests of the police outweigh the interests of the public the police claim to serve." According to the police violence report released in 2021, 1,136 people were killed by police. They were only charged in 12 of these cases. That is a clear abuse of power. George Floyd was a citizen wrongfully murdered by a police officer in 2020. Floyd used a counterfeit $20 bill to pay per pack of cigarettes, and when police showed up to detain him, he resisted arrest. In the efforts to detain Floyd, Officer Derek Chauvin put his knee on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. While Chauvin was kneeling on his neck, Floyd was saying, "I can't breathe," and this resulted in his death later. How are situations like this okay? Situations of unarmed citizens being victims of police brutality and being wrongfully murdered. This is why we say defund the police, because are these really the kind of people you want defending you and your rights? Those who not care about others' well-being and will do anything for an arrest? After law enforcement ruthlessly arrests citizens, they bring them to the courts. This is where innocents are convicted. The Innocence Project is an organization that helps wrongfully convicted people escape prison. Since its founding in 1992, it has helped free over 200 people. If the courts were more thorough in their convictions, there would be next to no innocent people in prison. While the fault of the courts lies in wrongful convictions, they're also responsible for wrongful acquittals. The case of O.J. Simpson is a clear example of this. Simpson was charged with the murder of his ex-wife Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman, but after an 8-month-long trial, Simpson was found not guilty, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. In 2007, he released a book called If I Did It, which described those murders in great detail as if he had committed them. Double jeopardy is a law that prevents an accused person from being tried for the same crime twice. It is also from the 7th Amendment of the Constitution. Because of this law, even if Simpson outrightly admits to the murders, he cannot be tried again. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Simpson and others, the American courts fail to carry out justice for the victims and let murderers go free. Punishments do not fit the crime in America. In Texas, if you commit first-degree murder, your prison sentence will be from 5 to 99 years. But if you have 200 to 400 grams of cocaine, your prison sentence will be from 10 to 99 years. That is more than premeditated murder. How does that make sense? Just last month, Carlos Allen was sentenced to 100 years in prison for selling fentanyl, a powerful opioid used as a pain medication. But just the day before, DeMarcus Shilley was sentenced to only 15 years in prison after he and 2 other men broke into the house of a man and his daughter and brutally murdered both of them. These cases do not even compare. One person was selling drugs and another killed 2 people. But who had the longer prison sentence? Detaining many people who commit nonviolent crimes, such as Carlos Allen, increases the amount of money spent on mass incarceration each year. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, America spends about $81 billion on mass incarceration. but this figure addresses only the cost of operating prisons, jails, parole, and probation. Including the cost of public employees, policing, judicial, and legal costs, America spends about $182 billion. With the points I just laid out, I think it is in the court's best interest to rule in the total overhaul of the current criminal justice system and begin rebuilding on America's morals and standards. The American criminal justice system doesn't need to be restarted. It's working perfectly as it is right now. The American criminal justice system is not broken or flawed or whatever else people say about it. It is the most perfect system in the world. In 2021, there were about 60 law enforcement officers that were shot and killed. That is over a 51% increase from the previous year. In 2020, there were about 61,000 assaults on police officers. Every day, officers go out into the world and deal with the most dangerous people in our society, not knowing if they'll return home or not. They're the best people that we have. But let's talk about the alternatives to our current law enforcement. There has to be some system in place or it will be total anarchy. The 17th century British philosopher Thomas Hobbes calls this anarchy the state of war, in his political science work, The Leviathan, which you read our sophomore year at MCA in Great Books 3. Hobbes famously summed life in these circumstances as nasty, brutish, and short. If there is no presence of law and order at all, a Leviathan will emerge to impose it. Without the police, there are only two alternatives: vigilante justice or mafia rule. On August 25, 2020, 18-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse went to Kenosha, Wisconsin amidst damaging protests following a white police officer shooting of a black man, Jacob Blake. While he was there, Rittenhouse ended up shooting 3 people and killing 2 of them. During his trial last November, Rittenhouse testified that he saw people were getting injured, and he felt it was his job to protect them and their businesses. Law enforcement becomes arbitrary and excessively violent when vigilantism becomes the rule. Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, is the most dangerous gang in America. They have an established reputation for extreme violence, killing with machetes, and have known members in 46 states. It has been determined that MS-13 has entered into an alliance with the Mexican mafia, and Mexican drug cartels peddle their drugs through their network. Street gangs are located throughout the United States and pose a large threat because of their involvement in drug distribution and heavy reliance on violence. Vigilantism and mafia rule replace democratic systems of justice with their thug system of justice. Are these really better alternatives to the current law enforcement officers we have right now? The prison and penalty system in America is one of the best in the world. In 2016, the United Nations estimated that nearly all inmates in Haiti's national prison have access to less than 1 square meter of space and are confined for 23 hours per day. But let us take a look at the alternatives to the American prison and penalty system. 1. No punishments at all. This would invite many people to commit crimes similar to these because there's nothing stopping them. 2. Just rehabilitative steps are offered. People may commit crimes just so they're able to go somewhere that merely attempts to try to treat them better, with no punishment at all. In December of 2018, a largely bipartisan prison reformation bill was signed by Donald Trump called the First Step Act. This act expanded rehabilitative opportunities, reduced mandatory minimum sentences for a number of drug-related charges, and formally banned some correctional practices. It received the support of progressives and conservatives, including Kamala Harris and Ted Cruz. This act shows the superiority of America's justice system and the caring nature of these countries' leaders on issues like this. The defense I've laid out for the criminal justice system in America clearly illustrates its perfect ability to carry out justice just the way it is, and any efforts to dismantle it are against America's morals and standards. After hearing both sides of the argument, it is safe to say that our justice system has a good foundation, but there are cracks in the foundation we need to address. And for the good of our society, we must strive to repair them to the best of our ability. High respect should be given to law enforcement officers. It is evident of the dangers they put themselves into every single day, and we should thank them deeply. Just like any other profession, there are bad officers who do bad things. It is just highly publicized when a law enforcement officer does something that is not equal to the law that they represent. If you decide to take a position that is known for upholding the law, it should come to no surprise to you that you should be more vigilant in your actions in all situations. It is alarming that someone with a certain amount of drugs can get more prison time than an actual murderer. Looking at the development of laws in more of a way that makes sense to people and society would be beneficial. Alternatives to imprisonment, such as probation or parole, should be exercised with dealing with first-case offenses and nonviolent offenses. Both of these actions will reduce the amount of money we spend on mass incarceration each year. The system as a whole needs to be more forgiving and restorative. Matthew 18:22 says, "Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, 'Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother who sins against me? Up to 7 times?' Jesus answered, 'I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. What is the goal of our penalty system? To purely punish or hopefully rehabilitate? Applying things about the criminal justice system to our lives may seem impossible because it seems like we'll never encounter the law in circumstances like that. It is a huge part of our society and we're paying lots of money for it, yet most people only know pieces of it. But here are 4 things each of us can do to live out a more just society. The first thing is to care about criminal justice. Scott Lai is a local defense attorney, as well as a former prosecutor and judge whom I had the honor to interview. On the subject of people caring about criminal justice, Mr. Lai said, "You'll see how much of your world is influenced by the criminal justice system, by law enforcement, and by factors that normal people don't realize. As an individual, you can come in contact with the criminal justice system in a number of ways. If you see a cop out on the street or are pulled over, that's the criminal justice system. If you're called into jury duty, that's the criminal justice system. When you vote on laws and legislation, you're voting on things that influence the justice system. These laws impact individuals on terms of defining what society will and will not accept and how police conduct their business. These laws determine sentencing guidelines and who's going to be kept in custody and jails. The second thing to do to educate yourself is to read books. A great book is one I've previously mentioned, The American Criminal Justice System, How It Works, How It Doesn't, and How We Can Fix It by Gerhard Falk. It provides points of view on both sides of many things I do not cover in this speech. The third thing you can do is listen to podcasts. A podcast I've listened to recently is called Reformed, a criminal justice podcast by Anna Tyler, where she talks about mass incarceration, the prison industry, and criminal justice reform as a whole. The fourth and last thing you can do is watch documentaries. A documentary series on Netflix that is very informative is called I Am a Killer, where criminals on death row are interviewed about their crimes and the effect on their lives and others. Once we learn to care about criminal justice and the effect it has on people's lives, we can learn to care about the justice being carried out in our own country. By doing these 4 things, we can become better jurors, voters, and better equipped if we're ever in the situation to need this knowledge. Law enforcement, courts, and the prison and penalty system are all major pieces of the American criminal justice system as a whole. Looking back at both the good and the bad of each of these attributes, I think this answers the question posed at the beginning. Does our criminal justice system need to be completely restarted, or is it working perfectly as it is right now? The answer is somewhere in the middle. It is clear that our justice system has faults, and it's in need of reformation, but it's also clear that we have a good foundation to base these reformations on. No system of justice will ever be perfect or is perfect. The only system that is God's. Out of the 2.3 million incarcerated people, reformation could help 1 person or 1 million people. We as citizens need to educate ourselves about the criminal justice system so we can make better decisions on influencing those around us to create needed change. Isaiah 1:17 says, "For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are those who wait for him." If God cares about justice, shouldn't we? Thank you.
Excellent job, Jules. I'll let you take a drink of water before I ask you your first question. All right, so to start off with, what are your plans for next year?
Next year, I'm going to be attending Abilene Christian University and majoring in political science with a minor in sociology, and then maybe possibly going to law school after that, but I don't know.
What put you down that path?
Mainly our government class this year that we take, and every week we did like current events about things that were happening in like the political world and nationally and internationally. And just like reading about all of that and like forming my own opinions and like learning more about it was really interesting. And yeah, I just like that a lot.
All right, very cool. Well, this oral obviously was aligned with that a good bit. So I've got kind of a couple of series of questions for you. The first, for my first round, I'd like to kind of go maybe more philosophic, and then the second round, when it comes back, kind of talk through some of the particulars in your thesis. So first off, like, where does justice come from? Just like that concept of justice.
Like the whole thing, like execution-wise too.
Just the whole thing. Yeah, the idea of justice, like even beyond criminal justice, like where does the idea of right and wrong come from?
I think that you can see it from like the beginning of the Bible, or like the beginning of like creation, like with Cain and Abel, with the whole murdering. Like that was obviously wrong, and justice needed to like happen and like be given. And so we can see that there, and then throughout the Bible too, with like the judges, or like things happening and the justice being carried out for them and the victims.
On what authority do we determine if something's just or unjust?
On earth, we can only determine what's just and unjust based on like what we know and the laws that like past humans have made, and what we determine is like right and wrong, and that comes from the objective truth and morality from God. And so knowing that he is the objective truth, and he provides objective morals that shows us what's right and wrong, which helps us carry out justice. So
justice ultimately comes from God?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
When we're measuring criminal justice, I mean that's more the topic of your paper specifically, how do we know if we're getting better or worse? Like, what's our standard for saying this criminal justice system is perfect, this criminal justice system is really wonky and off, and how do we measure if it's like what things actually are improvements for that or not, besides our own opinion?
I think that we can base on if the criminal justice system is getting better or not based on like how many like innocent people are in prison, but also how people who get out of prison do, because like after you've taken someone from society for like X amount of years, and in the effort to like rehabilitate them or like correct them, and then you let them back out into society, seeing how like they operate and like readjust in society, I think shows how the like penalty system worked or didn't work, and like trying to help someone overcome the past that they did and then keep moving forward.
So rehabilitation is it sounds like that's a really important measurement for it. So if somebody serves their time, how are they after they serve that time? Are they a better person or a worse person? Or
I think so.
How do you think we're doing on that?
I have something here. I think that it's better than it was. I definitely do, because but there's a statistic I have in my paper is that within 3 years of release, over 68% of offenders are rearrested, which is a very high percentage in such a short amount of time. And so I think it has been getting better, but
within
I think
3 years, you said?
Yeah. And so with like someone being released from prison, within the next 3 years of them being out, over 68% of them are rearrested again. And I think that's an astronomically high number that we could attempt to get down by doing better.
Okay. That does sound disturbing that it's that high on that. You mentioned in your paper, the Arrestia, which is a Greek trilogy that we read in Great Books 1. And it's a long saga, but kind of it culminates in the ending of this cycle of violence, of like blood feuds, of just, well, you killed this person, so somebody else on the other side retaliates. And And so it culminates with the ending of blood feuds and kind of the advent of the rule of law. Like Athena comes down and says, here, instead of you guys just killing each other, getting an endless cycle of revenge, let me give you a trial, and we'll have the rule of law, and we'll let that settle it and be the end of it. And so it's kind of built up as like this really happy moment of human achievement, but there's also this mix of failure in it too, because when they give the trial, there's 12 jurors and you get a hung jury. It's 6-6, and so it's unable to meter out true justice. Do you think that we as humans are doomed to partially miscarry justice when we try to correct a situation, particularly with like law enforcement and things like that?
Do you mean do you think we're ever going to fully get it right?
Yeah, or maybe said another way, are we going to partially get it wrong?
Okay. I think that we are never, ever going to fully get it right. In all areas that I've talked about, there's always going to be that human error that we have, because we're not perfect beings at all. And so
if that's the case, should we just not... So we say, well, we're going to screw this up, so let's not pursue justice at all?
No. No, I think that we should still try to do the best that we can and pursuing justice instead of just giving up altogether. Oh, who cares? This person's probably going to end up in prison anyway. Let's put him there. Or other things like that. And still going through the correct ways to do things and doing things the best that we can, even if we know that faults may happen. But I think that if we try the best that we can, they're less likely to happen.
Okay, so my last question for you on this one, I don't know the answer to this one, but I'm curious just your thoughts on it. Are there healthy boundaries that we should not cross as we're trying to pursue justice in the right way? Are there things that we should say, this is off limits in trying to just micromanage how far or how precise that justice is going to be?
Things that we shouldn't do?
Yeah, things that we shouldn't do, or are there just some things we have to say, you know what, this is an area where we don't know, and if we try to go beyond this and trying to bring about a perfect justice, we're more likely to do harm than good. Does that make sense? Kind of.
The first thing I think of is there's obviously a ton more, but one is that when I talked about in my speech, in my paper, was that alternatives to the prison system we have now, one alternative would be no punishments at all. You would just bring the person wherever and then be oh, this was a bad thing, but then you don't do anything to them, because the efforts to rehabilitate come truly from you just being this was a bad thing, learn from this bad thing. And I don't think people would learn if you just did that. And so I think there should still be punishments, and not just you just get off with a slap on the wrist or less.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Great job, Jules. So in your paper, you talk a little bit about the media and how the media portrayed some of the cases that you brought up in your speech. How do you personally decipher what is true in the media and what higher powers are trying to get you to believe?
This goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning about our government class and the current events. And so each week when we did a current event, I would find one, and then I would read it from two different opposing news sources. So example, Fox News and CNN, I would read about the same event if they did an article about both, and then I would pick a third type of international, BBC or something, if they all did the same article, and read all three of those to see what actually happened and what each side was telling themselves, and then what should have been, what was a common theme of being told, and just taking emotion out of it and looking at the facts from three different sources than just one.
Have you found any sources that you think are less biased than others that you would recommend?
Not really. I think that the news sources we have definitely in America are pretty biased, like left or right leaning, or someone who just like hates both and they just write like that too. But if I had to like if I had to say something for people to read, would maybe like look at like international news, because they have a pretty like outside view of like what happens here, and so usually it's pretty like neutral and just facts based. But I don't know.
I don't know if you read A World Split Apart by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in World History 2, or if you remember it.
I don't think so.
Okay, it's a speech.
You signed it.
I read it in my class this year, and it was, I highly recommend for anyone just kind of interested in this kind of topic. But he talks about the media, and he kind of compares and contrasts Western media versus like, he's from Russia, and so versus communist Russia, and how the media looks over there. And he doesn't really give a solution for the problem, but he does say that in communist Russia, the media are appointed officials, so they're controlled by the government, and they have limits on what they can and can't say. Do you think, knowing that and knowing what you know about our media, that there's a better system than what we have now in getting out information?
Comparing us to like Russia?
Yeah, I guess those are like the two extremes. Do you think that we could find middle ground between them?
I don't know. I've never really thought about that, honestly. I think that what we have now is good because it's like free speech, and so you can say basically like what you want on anything that happened, like your point of view, which can be good to hear that, and then sometimes bad depending on what they say. So I don't know, honestly. I really don't. But I think that ours is better than Russia. So
good. Okay. What do you think is the most? You talk about a lot of problems in the system in your speech. What do you think the most pressing one is, and what should be our most imminent step forward as a nation?
I think that, like what an answer to one of Mr. Schumann's questions was, like rehabilitating and restoring people that have like committed crimes, I think is important, because that like return to prison rate is extremely high. And so just like in the ways of restoring, we can just educate them on like different jobs while they're in prison, maybe like offer like different classes of like types of jobs they can have when they get out of prison, like I don't know, like a car mechanic or stuff like that, and then give them those skills so when they get out they can go immediately into working something that from the skills that they built. And then so doing so, we would be like setting them up for more success than just like keeping them in prison. They do like a few things here and there, and then like let them out, like, okay, go get a real job. So we'd be setting them up for success, and in doing so, and maybe like in doing so when they get out of prison, and also in prison, we could get rid of that like hopelessness feeling that they may have that pushed them to commit the crimes or do the things that they did because they felt like there was like no other option. And so in giving them skills and showing them the new opportunities they can have from like doing this when they're like out, then we would like be restorative.
Is there anything other than, you mentioned getting information through podcasts and Netflix series, is there anything as individuals we can do to kind of push that forward, do you think?
Like push the like rehabilitation, restoration thing forward? I think first would be educate yourself on basically what that is. And so like read a book about the system, or like rehabilitation, or like statistics of people who like are rearrested and how their lives outside of prison are. And then something that I mentioned in my speech is like voting too. A lot of the things that are listed, that I think are listed in like voting, is like some things for the criminal justice system, or like specific laws that like pertain to different things that I've talked about. And so learning about those before you go vote would also be important, and then we can influence that way too.
Awesome, thanks.
Well done, Jules. Okay, that was close enough. They told us not to move the bass. Okay, so I want to backtrack a little bit to when you were answering Mr. Schumann's question about what you plan to do in the future, and talked about how your government class kind of sparked that interest. What specifically drew you into doing your senior thesis about the criminal justice system? Because there's a lot of aspects of government. Why did you want to focus on this?
So I've always been like kind of interested in like the like criminal kind of area, because like from like watching TV shows like Criminal Minds. I don't know if any of y'all have seen that. Yeah. So that, and then just learning about that, and then in government when I would read articles about like criminals or like prisoners and their situation and stuff. And so I was like wrestling with doing this topic or some other ones. And then one weekend I was watching the series that I mentioned in my speech, the I Am a Killer one, where they talk to people on death row. And I was watching some episodes, and this one episode was about this man who, when he was little, he was like abused in all the ways by like his dad, because his mom died. And then foster care got him from his dad, and then he like went around to home. And then he was 10-ish maybe, and this older like kind of like grandfather aged man who was like really known in the community for being super sweet and stuff was like, hey, is it okay if I like adopt you? And the boy, he was like, yeah, of course, like they've been like he had been fostering him before. And so then the like grandpa man adopts him, and then he starts doing all the things that his like dad did to him too. And then no one would believe him when he was like telling people what was happening. And this older man also adopted a lot, like 3 other little boys, I think, too, and it was happening to all of them, and like no one would believe him. And he went to like the local the local police department and told them, and they're like, he wouldn't do that, like that's not the type of person he is. And so no one would believe him. And so one day he went over to his adopted dad's parents' house that was just on the street in the efforts to tell them what had been happening, because his best friend in the episode was like, he went down there to tell them what he was going to do. And so he goes down there, and then he's like starts talking to them, and the next thing you know, he like blacks out, and then he wakes up and they're like dead on the floor. And so he like, his best friend was saying how he thinks what happened was that he like went to tell them, they didn't believe him, and after all these years of like pent up trauma and abuse and like with no outlet and no one believing him, he just like snapped and then killed them. And so then he got the death penalty. And so just seeing how like there are so many times in there where someone could have done something, or someone could have stopped that from happening, or like even if they couldn't have stopped it from happening, instead of just throwing him into prison, which no one helping him, or like him going to therapy that he obviously needs, and like being helped through these things, that was just like not right for me to like watch and deal with. And so that's what like pushed me to doing this. 'Cause I came to Mr. Schumann's office like the next day, and I was like, I am doing the criminal justice system. So
Awesome. So talk about like the first aspect of the criminal justice system that you talked about, law enforcement. So I'm curious, I feel like in the past few years we have seen a lot more in the news and media about police acting in corrupt ways. Is there a history of police corruption and the media is just making that more visible to us now, or is that something new, like in the past few years?
I think it has definitely always been there. From like, I think it definitely has been, because we're all born of sin, and so just having that sin nature with people get corrupt and things happen. And so I think it's always been around, but I do also think that we're learning more about it now, just because people seem to me be like more aware of it, or more like wanting to stop it. And so it's just being put on the media a lot more, I think.
Do you think that's a good thing, that people are learning more about it?
Yes, I do think it's a good thing. We should stop corruption, but I don't think it'll like ever fully be stopped, as I was saying before about how like we're not going to achieve like a perfect system of justice like ever. So it's good that people are learning more about it. It's the how do we fix the corruption that is more of the issue than people just learning about it.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned defunding the police. Do you think that's a good option for addressing the issues, or
no?
yeah, and I think you kind of covered that. What would happen if there's no law enforcement and dangers of that? So are there any good options to addressing the problems in law enforcement?
I didn't really research that specifically, so I don't really know, because I don't know what type of training they go through or situations that they're put in before they become officers. And so maybe I'll have to look into it. But maybe that area, I don't know, the training or situations or what. Yeah. Because then you would just be educating them more, I think. But I don't really know.
That's okay. Okay, and then moving on to the courts, kind of. What are factors other than just the facts of the case that can influence verdicts?
I think that there are a lot of other things from the facts that can influence a verdict on somebody. That can be it can be little things like what the person's wearing, what they said, what they look like where the trial is taking place, or the history of the judge or the jury. If a similar thing happened to someone that they know, that could influence how what they think should happen to this person. And so I think a lot of things can influence that, which is things that are out of our control, but I don't know specifically.
Is there anything that we can control or do to make the system more objective?
Maybe if it's looking at the history of I don't know. I don't really know. I didn't really research this, but I'm just going to say what I think, and then I don't know. But looking at the history of the presiding judges over it, seeing it, how many other cases they've presided over that are similar to this, to the case that they're looking over now, or what their personal views are on these things, because that can influence what someone makes a verdict out of too, is what they personally think about it. The same could be said for the lawyers too, the defense attorneys and the prosecutors, looking at their history of cases and how many times they've been in court. Because if there's a prosecutor who normally deals with I don't know, traffic tickets or something, and all of a sudden he's put on this murder case, and he's also never been to court, that's just a total different change up, and that the defense lawyer may not have that, or vice versa too. So maybe that, but I don't know.
Okay. In your paper you did mention that the courts could ensure that both the accuser and accused were properly represented with talented lawyers. So is there, how can they practically ensure that? Is there a way for that to happen?
Yeah, I think that connects to what I just said, is just looking at the history of both lawyers and seeing how many times both have been to court, or how many times both have dealt with the same type of cases. Because if you have someone going against somebody who's never been to court and they're going against somebody who's been to court, that's all they do is go to court. That's not completely fair for that. But yeah, I don't really know.
Okay, thank you.
Just move the base. Okay, so death penalty. You mentioned a good bit of that in your paper, but you didn't bring it up in the speech. What are your takes on the death penalty?
Okay, 1 second. Okay, so at the beginning of my research for this, or when I decided to do this, I was pretty torn on the death penalty, because I think it is a huge deal, and I didn't think I had enough knowledge to form an firm opinion in it, and so I started off 50-50. But then as I researched more into it and read the pros and the cons, I have decided that I am more against the death penalty, because I don't I looking at both sides. There were some Old Testament verses Genesis 9:6 and Exodus 21:12 that in the Old Covenant they were talking about how they basically said the death penalty was okay, or give examples of that. But then just thinking about how after Jesus came, he got rid of like the laws of Moses so as to live under this new covenant under him for salvation. And then looking at the example in John 8 where the Pharisees bring the adulterer woman to him and are like, shouldn't we like stone her? That's what the law of Moses says, is that we should kill her. And he was like, he who has not sinned be the first to cast the first stone. And so then all of them left because all of them sinned. And then he was like, he like didn't condemn her in that situation at all. And then also a quote from The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien says that many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them that do not be eager to deal out death and judgment? And so that's just saying how that makes me think about how like we ultimately cannot give life at all. That's God, and so he should have that ultimate ability to take it away too, and not us.
Okay, thank you for your opinion on that one. Mm-hmm. Get two more questions. I'm going to pass it over. What would you tell somebody that says America is just fundamentally broken and flawed and needs to be swept aside? And then what would you tell someone who says that America is perfect and in no need of any reform?
Okay. For the person who says that we're not in need of any reform, I would encourage them to look at the percent of people who go back to prison when they're done, the percentage of people that are innocent in prison, the percentage of the amount of people that have been killed on death row that ended up being innocent after they found out. And just looking at all of the situations that show that it is not perfect at all. And then to the person who says that it needs like completely overhaul, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
I would say look at the good that the justice system has done, and so looking at all the bad they have done very bad things, but then also looking at the good of the criminals that they have put away or have gotten rid of, like serial killers or like people who have done like really bad things and like gotten caught and then putting them away. That was a good thing for society, and so not just focusing on the bad, sinful things that happened, but the good things that the justice system did too.
Okay. Those are good answers. My last question for you, can you repeat that Isaiah verse that you ended your speech with?
Oh, yeah.
I know it's hard to quote when you're not in the flow.
Okay, yeah. For the Lord is a God of justice, blessed are those who wait for him.
Yeah, just that idea of waiting, like blessed are those who wait for him and waiting for justice. What role do you think waiting for God's justice has in us administering justice on earth?
I think that knowing that after someone commits heinous crimes and that we have given them the justice of like going to prison, but knowing also that if they don't like repent while they're in prison, that God's justice will ultimately be carried out for them in eternity. And also looking at even if the people who do get away and like get acquitted, like Simpson, knowing that he will answer for the things that he's done amongst others who have not been convicted, and that we just have to wait for God to carry out his eternal justice on them.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I mean, as a society, we should pursue justice to the best that we can, but also knowing that God will provide that ultimately, and it's not up to us. And there can be a great relief in that, even as we pursue it. So, thank you.
I don't remember where it was in your speech, but kind of toward the end of your paper, you quote Matthew 18:22 when Peter asked Jesus about forgiveness. Mm-hmm. I was just wondering, how do you think we should correlate Jesus' response to the criminal justice system?
I think that, because basically in that verse, Jesus wasn't saying just 77 times. He was like over and over and over. And so I think that if someone has been, after crimes that someone has done that are bad, just being able to forgive them, and then if they get out and they continue to do crimes, just still being like forgiving towards them, because that's what Jesus would do. And then
what do you think that forgiveness looks like from like a law enforcement or a penalty system perspective?
For forgiveness and the penalty system, I would say two things briefly. One is looking at the sentences for like criminals, especially criminals who do like non-violent crimes, like the example, that I give in my speech. Just seeing how if they do like have a certain amount of drugs, just being like forgiving of that and not giving them 99 years for like the small thing that they've done. And this movie that I watched last night, actually, one quote was there from that, you're still better than the worst thing that you've done. And so if someone does something that's terribly bad, that doesn't make them that whole action. That's just something that they did. And so being forgiving in that way in the penalty system and not throwing them away for life for something small. And also not like killing them. So that would be like going against the death penalty. They'll be not killing them, because that is not a very like forgiving thing to do, or like in the spirit of what Jesus would do. And yes. And then for law enforcement, I don't know. Maybe. No, I don't know. No, I'm not saying anything. I don't know.
So you do think that personal forgiveness should kind of rise to the level of the courts and how we sentence people?
Yes, just having that whole like more attitude of like forgiveness, merciful kind of attitude than just like punishing attitude.
Do you think that there is a danger in taking that to an extreme level?
Yes. Like when Mr. Schumann asked about something, and I said that, that something that would be bad would be to not have punishments at all. And so that's the extreme of taking like forgiveness and mercy to the extreme level of being like, okay, like you said, you're sorry, like, okay, like nothing's going to happen to you. Like, no, something should still happen, but like within reason, something should happen.
Do you think there's a practical way we could find that middle ground, or do you think it's kind of a case-by-case thing?
I think it's a case-by-case thing.
Okay. So I have a more personal question.
Okay.
You and I have had lots of great conversations back in the workroom about this topic and many other topics, and you seem like a very justice-driven person, and I really appreciate that about you. What are some other things or other areas in our society that you feel need reform or feel like you want to pursue justice over?
Something that immediately comes to mind is the foster care system and that whole network, because that's what Addie Todd did her thesis about last year, and it was very impactful, just talking about the like percentage of kids who go into foster care and the percentage of them that end up in like prison or doing drugs or on the streets, and just seeing how that like ruins their lives basically, and no one's like really doing anything about it. And so I've always wanted to adopt kids for like a long time, and so it's definitely something that I really want to do, to be able to impact their lives and just like help them, and then also just help the foster care system as a whole, like the attic, just like donating to the attic or helping out or other systems like that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so I kind of want to go back to what you and Mr. Schumann were talking about earlier, about how God is a God of justice. and he is going to carry out eternal justice. So if I, as a believer, know that's true, but I don't personally feel like I've been affected by the criminal justice system, why should I care at all or be concerned about it, rather than, like, where do I find a balance between just sitting back and waiting for God to carry out eternal punishment versus caring about it while I'm here on earth?
That's a good question. So in the efforts of still waiting for God to, like, carry out his justice, because we know it's ultimately what he's going to do, are you asking what if someone, like, knows that, why should they care about anything else? Okay. Mm-hmm. I think that the effect that it has on people's lives, no matter if they're a believer or not, should show us that this is something that does need to be, like, helped on. And so knowing that still God's going to carry out his eternal justice to those who do wrong, knowing that we can still do things on earth to help maybe, like, prevent the amount of people that's going to happen to, or to just help restore those individuals as a whole. And something that I've thought about, that not someone that has to do this, but just showing the effect, is that it's Miss Jackson's husband who goes to the prisons to talk to them. Okay, yeah. So he goes to prisons and he talks to men about Jesus and God, and he knows that God's going to carry out his justice, yet he's still doing these things for them. And that just shows that we're still called to know God and make him known, even to those people who have done bad things. And so while knowing that God is going to carry out justice, we can still do things like that and, like, help the system with, like, trusting him at the ultimate end.
That's a good answer. Is there anything else that you learned from either your book or interview that you didn't get a chance to share in your speech that just really stood out to you?
Not really. Actually, yeah. It's just something that I've thought about too, is the, like, just the percent of, like, people in prison who have done non-violent crimes, such as, like, having a drug charge or, like, having a white-collar crime or something that, like, is not violent, is almost 50%. And in 2002, it was almost 50% of people who were in prison. And I just think that's an insane amount of number, and that can just, by reducing the amount of people in prison, you reduce the amount of money used on mass incarceration. And so for the people who have done nonviolent crimes, like I mentioned in my speech, other things such as, like, probation or parole, where you just, like, watch them and make sure they're not going to do, like, fraud or something again, instead of putting them in prison for, like, 20 years, would be more restorative for them and then save money too. So that's just something else.
Awesome. And then lastly, talking on a practical standpoint, you mentioned that things that we can do to be involved in learning more about the criminal justice system are to read books, listen to podcasts, and watch documentaries. So are there any others besides the ones you named in your speech that you would recommend to someone who's listening and wants to learn more?
I've not listened to another podcast, but another book is, I read one about strictly just about the death penalty, and it was four articles for it and 4 articles against it. And I recommend it to somebody who, even if you're, like, feel like you're, like, decided on one side, just looking at that and seeing the other side's different point of view, or if you're, like, more undecided and don't really know, like I was, reading that is a really good educator too. And then for another documentary would be, there's one about Centoya Brown, where she basically killed her kidnapper, and then when she was a minor, and then she got tried as an adult, and then she got sentenced to a life sentence, I think, but then just her like story and stuff, and how people work to get that like dropped from her was really interesting too. I recommend that to see how that like impacts people's lives. So yeah.
Thank you, and great job. Now it's your turn to interrogate us.
Okay, who wants to go first? Who wants to go?
You choose.
Okay, you can go first. Okay, so you are the only person on this panel who has kids. So what is the funniest thing you've ever seen your kids do? Like, whether you were like participating with them or just like saw them do it amongst themselves.
I don't know if this is the funniest thing I've ever seen them do, but this is a recent one. And as a parent, my memory just gets shot every day. So our boys are 10 and 9, and then our little girl's 3. And Selah is the sweetest thing for like 23 and a half hours of the day. And then for like 30 minutes, she just kind of randomly turns into Mr. Hyde or Mrs. Hyde. So she's like a rabid raccoon for like 30 minutes. And so it's just all her sin gets confined to that, and the rest of it's great. So the other day, the boys were kind of arguing over like their Nerf guns. And so they have these big Nerf guns in their room, and they're like, this one's mine, this one's mine. And then while they're arguing over it, it gets set down, which is kind of unlike them, because usually if they're fighting over something, one of them's clinging it and the other's trying to rip it from their brother's cold, dead hands. And so they set the gun down while they're arguing, and Selah, who's 3, just knows this is something that's precious to them, and it's in their room. And I'm in her room putting away laundry, like just kind of the clothes are folded. I'm like, okay, I'm going to put this up before this gets unfolded. And then all of a sudden, she just comes bursting through the door in her room, like holding this like gun in her hand, just like, and then runs and throws it in her tent. I mean, it's like she just broke out of the bank and stole something and doesn't know what to do with it, but knows it's precious, and then just hides it and then runs off. And it was like, what is going on with this little girl? So
That's funny.
They've done lots of things that are funnier than that, but that's the recent one.
That's funny. Okay, Miss Gladstone. So you and your husband both work here, and so y'all went to school here, and you've spent a lot of time together. And so both of y'all played basketball, right? Yeah, okay. So if Mr. Gladstone was going up against an NBA pro player, which one do you think you could beat in a 1v1? Or if any?
Oh. I don't know. He's got a bad back right now, so it might be deadly. I'm also not very well versed in the NBA. I'm sorry. But as his supportive wife, I'll say he could beat any of them.
Nice. Okay, KP. So
Mrs. Keenan.
Ms. Keenan. So this year you taught psychology with 7 of us, and we've had many interesting discussions and points of view given. So after knowing each one of us from that class, which person would you be handcuffed to for 24 hours, and why?
I don't know how to answer this. I'll choose Madison because she's my senior assistant. So I'm biased. And she's nice.
It's true. She'd make you ride horses with her, though.
That'd be cool. I'd love to learn. Sorry to the 6 of the rest of y'all.
All right, I got one more. So Eli's top Selah on this one. Now I'll have a chance to think about it. So when Eli was getting potty trained about 4 or 5 years ago, we're driving to Dallas, and we pull over at one of those little parks, like where they have the rest stops, and the restroom said sign closed. And I'm like, okay, here's the deal. Eli, go pee on that bush over there. Do not turn around and face the oncoming traffic. Just go pee on that bush and we'll be good. And so he runs over there and is doing what we said, and then he goes to the bush and then he just like goes, huh, and then runs off and then faces the oncoming traffic and just whizzes that way. And he comes back in the car, I'm like, Eli, what did we tell you to do, and what did you do? And he's like, you told me to go pee on that bush and not face the traffic, and I turned around the other way. Why did you do that? Well, it was either that or pee on that sleeping man under the bush. I was like, good choice, Eli. Get in the car, let's go. So...
That's fine.
Very matter of fact, that guy. So, on that note, Jules, thank you for sharing about this really, really complex topic. I mean, it's so complex, it's hard to drill down in any one spot, and you did a good job of kind of covering the breadth of that. I've really appreciated just your hard work this year as my senior assistant in American history, and I think you're going to do great things as you go to ACU with your passion for justice. You also have a mercy side, and just kind of balancing both of those is very needed in today's world. And so I'm going to pray for you, and then we'll dismiss. Heavenly Father, God, I thank you for Jules. I thank you for her heart. I thank you for her mind. And Lord, I pray that you continue to sharpen her mind and soften her heart, and bring just your grace and truth to bear in this world. Lord, I pray that you can help each of us to live more justly and to extend mercy more readily as our world is hurting and broken. And Lord, as we strive for those things, I pray that we do not take your job upon ourselves and try to play the role of God in administering justice, but that we seek and wait for your coming. Maranatha. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.